Well, hello and welcome to today's HIPAA Chat. I'm Carol Flagg of Answers Media Network. Thanks for tuning in. If this is your first time to HIPAA Chat, welcome. If you're a repeat customer, sit back and relax. You know what to expect with our conversation, followed by a Q&A. Of course, HIPAA Chat is produced and hosted by Answers Media Network. We are a series of topic-driven websites covering federal initiatives driving change in healthcare delivery. Collectively, the network sites and our radio station average 55,000 visits per month. Speaking of our radio, Healthcare Now Radio is a streaming 24/7 internet radio station and companion site. The station offers interviews, commentary from industry leaders in healthcare and health information technology, and currently streams to 1,000 US listeners a day, 1,400 worldwide. You can stream it on any device at healthcarenowradio.airtime.pro. HIPAA Chat is, of course, sponsored by eFax Corporate, a brand new J2 cloud services. Founded in 1995, J2 is an award-winning leading provider of internet services through its two divisions, Business Cloud and Digital Media. For more information about eFax Corporate and their products for secure transmission of ePHI, please visit enterprise.efax.com. And of course, our host of HIPAA Chat is David Harlow. He is a healthcare lawyer, consultant, and award-winning blogger with 25 years of public and private sector experience. His focus is, of course, on digital health law and policy, starting with HIPAA and state law healthcare data privacy and security planning and compliance for covered entities and business associates. This includes healthcare providers, big data analytics, and healthcare app developers. David also hosts a radio show, Harlow on Healthcare, which airs on our Healthcare Now radio station. You can tune in weekdays at 4:30 Eastern and stream the station on any device. Again, that's at healthcarenowradio.airtime.pro. I've provided his email. You can contact him at david@harlowgroup.net. Read his award-winning blog, healthblog.blawg.com. You can listen to the archive of podcasts of his radio show, Harlow on Healthcare, on our Healthcare Now Radio companion site, healthcarenowradio.com. And of course, follow him on Twitter at healthblog and at Harlow on HC. And we have a special guest joining with us HIPAA Chat today. We don't do this very often, but we're going to be talking something very topical. So joining the conversation a little bit later on is Farah Janmar. Farah Janmar is founder and president of Inspectus, a globally respected digital health innovation consultancy firm. He's been recognized for helping the health industry understand how digital technologies influence the perceptions and beliefs of customers, medical professionals, and others. In 2012, he launched Digital Pulse, the world's first research innovative data research program that looks at how e-patients perceive a range of health technologies and issues. In 2014, he expanded the Digital Health Pulse project to focus on events, virtual events held for health executives, providers, and patients around the world. You can contact him at fjohnmar@inspectus.com, and of course follow him on Twitter at farj and Inspectus LLC. And of course, HIPAA Chat is available past events on LinkedIn, on YouTube. If you go to YouTube and, on LinkedIn and YouTube, as well as on SoundCloud. So you can go to YouTube, and if you search for HIPAA Chat, it'll come up. It's available as on-demand podcast on our Healthcare Now Radio SoundCloud channel under the HIPAA Chat playlist. And if you go to LinkedIn and search for HIPAA Chat, you will find our group where we also post the recorded videos and podcasts of previous HIPAA Chats. On today's HIPAA Chat, we're going to be talking about three things. First, about a judge's decision to uphold a doctor's conviction for criminal HIPAA violation. We're talking about the new GDPR in the EU that goes into effect May 25th, this Friday. And then finally, our guest is joining us to talk about the Facebook impact on digital health and data security. David, I'm turning this over to you, and I will, of course, join you back with the time that we have remaining for Q&A from the audience.
Thanks, Carol, and hello, everybody. Welcome back to HIPAA Chat. Wanted to talk today briefly about the recent court case that resulted in a criminal conviction for a HIPAA violation. This is not something that we hear about on a regular basis, and I thought it was worth calling out as something notable. Fortunately or unfortunately, we seem to see a steady stream of news stories about HIPAA violations, about privacy and security data breaches in the healthcare space. It's a weekly, if not a daily occurrence. And someday, I hope that people will get a better handle on what they need to do. And I hope that none of our listeners are being affected by these breaches. But this is a real wake-up call. And again, hopefully not something that one of our listeners needs to be aware of directly, because this criminal conviction for a HIPAA violation was tied to a large-scale Medicare fraud enterprise, where a physician was involved in a Medicare fraud scheme with a pharma company. And the prior authorization paperwork for this particular prescription for brand name drugs was falsified. And the investigation was around the false claims sort of issue, the over prescription of certain drugs and the phony speaking fees that had been paid by the pharma company to the doctor. But in the course of delving into this investigation, one of the investigators asked, "So, how did you document these fake prior authorizations?" And it turned out that the physician and her staff had provided medical record information to the pharma company, which was then used, or its representatives, which was then used to doctor up these phony prior authorizations. The import of that from a HIPAA perspective is that this is a sharing of PHI for reasons other than legitimate treatment, payment, or healthcare operations. And that is what brought the doctor into the criminal realm under a HIPAA violation. So there's a heavier fine and penalty and imprisonment possible for this physician for the false claims side of the case, but there is in fact jail time and a monetary fine for the HIPAA violation as well. So the lesson here is that there are many roads to HIPAA and HIPAA violations. This is an unexpected one, but the point is that you don't have to be involved in something so egregious as a Medicare fraud scheme in order to be in a situation where you may be sharing PHI with someone outside the confines of the legitimate treatment, payment, and healthcare operations sphere, and thereby get caught up in this sort of violation. So the basic HIPAA violation here is sharing the information inappropriately. So it's a good object lesson, something to remember. Also on the information sharing front is the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which in the EU goes into effect on May 25th. That's this Friday. We've been hearing about this for the past couple of years, and the day is finally here. So the question is, what does that mean to me, right? What do I care about GDPR, about a European regulation that does not necessarily affect any sort of healthcare operations in the US? Well, for many of you listening, that is in fact a fair assessment. Will not affect you if your operations are entirely local within the US, but it may affect you to the extent that this becomes a new standard. As part of the Facebook hearings in Congress recently, one of the topics of conversation was, should we not simply adopt GDPR as a US rule for broader privacy protections for American citizens? If that system were in place here, then everyone in major markets around the world, here and in the EU, would be subject to the same sets of privacy protections, Right now we have a little bit of a patchwork approach in the US, as you know, and it is not as thorough or complete sort of protection as the GDPR scheme is for Europeans. Many of us, if not all of us, have seen little notices on websites from global providers in the past weeks or months updating privacy policies and so forth, and all that is driven by the GDPR compliance date. There's basically a higher bar in terms of requiring opt-in from users under the GDPR versus privacy laws in the US. And what this drives is a privacy by design sort of approach. And that, I think, is the real big takeaway for GDPR for this audience, that we really need to be focused on privacy by design. And that is true not only if we are subject to GDPR rules, but also in any privacy scheme. We need to bake in the privacy, but that is one of the elements of the GDPR that is front and center. And it's a good thing that it is coming up to a higher level of consciousness in our minds, because we need to really incorporate organizational and technical mechanisms that can protect personal data in system design, in process design. In other words, privacy protection should be enabled by default. Now, in the broader GDPR scheme, that means that any secondary use of data may be done only on an opt-in basis. We have some of that in healthcare in the US. Marketing using data that was shared initially for treatment, payment, or healthcare operations purposes must be done on an opt-in basis only, right? You can't opt out of being marketed to. You need to opt in to being marketed to. And that's something that we need to have in our policies and procedures as covered entities and business associates. So there's the privacy by design. There's the consent concept. There are a lot of other technical issues. There are a lot of other issues that are maybe not necessarily directly relevant to a US audience, unless you're dealing from the US with a global customer base. Some of us are dealing with web properties that are open to users from around the world, or web properties that are targeted to different users in different countries around the world. And certainly in those cases, we need to be conscious of the GDPR and other analogs in other countries and jurisdictions. But for healthcare providers in the US, that's much less of an issue. It will be an issue only if Congress acts, for example, and adopts, let's say, GDPR, though that's certainly unlikely. I think possible on the horizon at some point in the next few years might be some form of a GDPR light kind of regulatory scheme that ups the ante a little bit and expands protections in a more predictable way. Some US technology companies have said that they would adopt GDPR protections for their US users as well as their European users. Facebook made some comment to that effect during the hearings, but then quickly backed away from it. Microsoft has made that statement more recently, although quite candidly, based on the way in which it collects user information or sort of error event information through the Windows operating system and otherwise, I don't really see how they are going to be in compliance with that, although there's certainly plenty of technical pieces there that I'm not privy to. So the point is that many multinational companies, even with respect to their operations in the US, are thinking about GDPR compliance because it's easier to have a single set of rules rather than multiple set of rules to follow. The goal of all these rules is really to establish a sense of trust in the user, right? On the one hand, this is about complying with the letter of the law. On the other hand, it's really about engendering trust in users, in customers, in potential users, in patients, in physicians, in other clinicians. We want to engender trust in order for people to be comfortable using all of these digital systems that we are promoting collectively. And the use of the digital systems makes things easier and better in many cases. And we need to make sure that that sort of sense is not lost, that there is trust, and that we're moving in a direction of increasing trust rather than eroding trust. And I think with that, I'd like to turn to a discussion of digital therapeutics, trust that we have in users of data derived from digital therapeutics, producers of those digital therapeutics. And the frame for this conversation, I think, is usefully provided by the whole Cambridge Analytica and Facebook situation, because we're having this broad conversation now about trust and about digital data being used in ways that we maybe didn't think about initially. And at this point, I'd like to bring Fard into the conversation to talk about the digital therapeutics, the data security issues that we may have. And Fard, I think for starters, I would ask you if you could define for us digital therapeutics.
Sure. And David, thanks for bringing me in on this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. So, digital therapeutics are a class of innovations that have been being under development for at least 5 years or so. Essentially, what they are software, hardware applications that can essentially be prescribed by physicians, either in combination with or actually replacing traditional prescription medications. The thing that makes digital therapeutics interesting is how they are designed to utilize data captured from either inside or outside of the body to provide really in-depth information about things such as whether or not patients are adhering or complying to their medications, their mental health status, and other factors that really provide physicians and other healthcare professionals as well as health institutions with really in-depth information about health status in a way that they've not been able to understand with traditional prescription medications or traditional digital devices. So that's
Right, because
basically
we always have our
yeah,
phones with us. We don't
yeah,
have our doctor with us. We don't have other
yeah.
things with us.
Yeah, and there are different categories of digital therapeutics. There are digital therapeutics being developed for example, diabetes management or prevention. Collecting data from people who have type 2 diabetes, for example, and using data and artificial intelligence to deliver very customized and personalized experiences. Another area where digital therapeutics is really taking off is in the area of behavioral health. So Proteus Digital Health has developed a innovation that has a sensor embedded in a pill that enables the healthcare providers and others to monitor whether or not patients are taking the medication. And so in the future, not only will the pill be monitoring adherence, but also how the medication is actually working inside of the body. So the pharmacology of the medication in specific types of patients. So this kind of data, this tracking of adherence and compliance and health status in a very intimate way, is something that digital therapeutics are bringing on, and it certainly has privacy implications in terms of whether or not this data is protected, whether or not people are comfortable having this data collected, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Now, I guess a previous generation of something doing the same thing as the Proteus pill tracker are the smart pill boxes that track when you take a pill out of the box, or the app where you press a button when you actually take the pill. This is actually tracking the physical ingesting of the pill.
Right. I mean, one of the big issues with the smart pill boxes, as well as the applications that required people to actively input adherence information, is that it's imperfect. So with the pill, with the sensor embedded pill, the patient doesn't have to do anything for that information to be tracked. They just need to go through their usual routine.
Right. And would you add to the sort of your working definition of digital therapeutics something that is FDA approved, or does that not, or is that not something that you would think is a requirement here to be talking about something that's therapeutic?
Yeah, well, the pathway that manufacturers have taken with many digital therapeutics is to actually seek FDA approval for them to be either prescribed as a replacement for traditional prescription medications or in combination with those. So there were companies, such as Proteus Digital Health, which received FDA approval for its digital therapeutic, as well as other companies such as WellDoc. These firms have sought and received various levels of FDA approval for their for their products, and this makes sense because they want to really demonstrate that these particular products are safe and effective, and also it provides a competitive advantage receiving FDA approval, and it makes reimbursement easier and all those types of things. So, in some respects, digital therapeutics are kind of taking on a pharmaceutical industry model from a development perspective.
Yes. I mean, from my perspective, to the extent that there is an AI component, the question is always, is this a black box? How does the FDA review something like this? If there's a machine learning component, if the algorithm changes over time, is the device, so to speak, that was approved in January still the same device that's functioning in July? I
Yeah,
think it
that's
opens a lot of new
yeah.
issues for the FDA, obviously.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons that the FDA is trying to develop the kind of more streamlined regulatory approach towards software that is embedded in these devices, because software changes on a consistent basis. So one of the things that the FDA is trying to do is to develop more standardized parameters or guardrails for regulating these software products that do change on a regular basis. And focus primarily, I think, on the impact of the algorithm, as opposed to what the algorithm looks like or the data points that are embedded within it. And so the key focus is, if they're using algorithmic diagnostic information to say detect, arrhythmias or those types of things. Those are other digital therapeutics that are being developed. That if the accuracy of the device is changing significantly, either especially if it's for the worse, obviously that's something that impacts the safety and efficacy of the product. So the FDA is kind of actively trying to develop a regulatory framework that allows for innovation to happen, but also operates more at the speed of digital.
Right, and they're rolling this out. There's an early stage effort underway with a handful of large companies, and we'll see if that gets expanded over the next 12 to 18 months. I'd be interested in hearing about the survey that you did with the Savvy Co-op with Jen Haranjeff and her group, and sort of what you learned there.
Sure. So just as a little bit of background, over the previous 3 quarters, since mid-2017, I have produced a quarterly report called DigiHealth Impact Track that is designed to provide additional context and information about how the digital health industry is evolving globally in ways that go beyond the top line investment numbers that are coming from organizations such as Startup Health and Rock Health. Basically, my feeling is that there's a lot of innovation happening globally that is not necessarily captured by what investors are focusing on. And so I decided to develop this quarterly research series as a kind of complement to the data that is coming out on a quarterly basis from Rock Health and Startup Health, et cetera. And the data set for the main findings in each of these quarterly reports comes from an intelligence platform that I developed and has been in operation since 2015. Currently has about 4.8 million data points that are being collected in real time about the digital health landscape. And what I use that platform to do in terms of developing these reports is try to provide people on a quarter-by-quarter basis a sense of which digital health trends are really receiving a significant amount of attention and traction so that they can start to understand what they should be focusing on, because that's a key question that I received a lot from people that I engage with is what's next, what's coming down the pike, what should we be paying attention to? And so this report is designed to do that. So for the latest edition of the report, I was very interested in trying to understand, well, what do patients think about these emerging digital health trends? There's really not a lot of data out there and attempts to really query patients on a regular basis about what they think about these emerging technologies. I had been doing some work, this was mentioned previously in the intro, for my DigiHealth Pulse research project, where I was kind of getting some lagging indicators about what patients think about these tools. And so I decided to collaborate with Savvy Cooperative, which is a great company focusing on delivering patient insights to a range of different organizations to say, well, you know, these are cutting edge technologies. They are coming into prominence very rapidly. What do they think about certain innovations that have been surfaced through this research? And so the survey is a survey of about 250 digitally savvy patients that really provides us with a sense of at least a slice of what patients are thinking about these innovations. And so I think for me, the value of this type of research is that it really does provide those interested in understanding a kind of beyond the surface understanding of what's happening with these technologies and where they're diffusing around the world and what patients think about them with a sense of those very important types of questions. So that's really where is kind of the background, the fuller background for the research, as well as the survey that Savvy Cooperative was kind enough to partner with me to develop for this edition of the DigiHealth Impact Track research project. And I'm hoping that we're able to do this every quarter.
Excellent. So to summarize, would you say that there are positive views, negative views, fears about the future, fears about the way information is currently used through these devices, or what's the general sense?
So with regard to digital therapeutics, it was very interesting to find that the patients that were responding to this particular question have mixed feelings about digital therapeutics. And this is actually something that people who have been observing the digital therapeutic landscape for quite some time have kind of said that tracking this type of information, that collecting information on adherence and compliance and how the medications are working inside of the body, et cetera, to some patients could be viewed as very invasive and not at all welcome. And so basically the feelings are mixed with a slight majority of folks saying that they either are uncomfortable with it and that they don't feel very positively about it. And so one of the things that really came through in terms of reading we collected in addition to the quantitative insights, the qualitative information, actually what patients were saying about these digital therapeutics. And we heard a lot of comments about Big Brother, about data being sold without their consent, and references to things that are happening daily, in our news environment right now in terms of privacy and security. And so that basically that information gave us a sense that perhaps some of the findings and the concerns with regard to the Facebook issue, I think could be impacting how people think about this type of data collection, et cetera, et cetera. And there was the question I guess that a lot of people have is whether or not what's going to be the impact of this. Not just what types of actions will patients potentially take if they are uncomfortable with this type of surveillance. And one of the biggest concerns that I think people should have with regard to patient concerns about digital therapeutics is whether or not this will actually defeat the main purpose of digital therapeutics, which is to improve adherence, compliance, and potentially health outcomes. If patients don't feel very comfortable being surveilled in this way, will they just not comply with these medications? Will they take other actions in order to kind of fool the system, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, no one knows at this point because these medications are so new. These methods are so new, and so typically, as is typical in the digital health space, innovation marches on, and the kind of cultural and privacy and security considerations are less addressed. And so I think this is something that anyone interested in innovation, anyone interested in having a positive impact on for using digital tools on these types of conditions should really be thinking about carefully.
Right. And this is, of course, applicable across the board, not just in healthcare, but here we're focusing on the healthcare concern and the sharing of information. And certainly people do try to defeat these information sharing efforts sometime, which sometimes defeats the care that we're trying to provide to patients. I wonder
Yeah.
if you have a
Mm-hmm.
sense in the work that you've done, or if we're still in too early a stage here, if we are really seeing the potential for improvement in the cost effectiveness of care as a result of using some of these tools.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the more promising areas that I've been tracking for quite some time around the use of digital therapeutics is in the area of behavioral health. There is a real need to develop solutions that enable people to understand, for example, whether a person is at risk of, for example, a major depressive episode that could lead to suicide potentially, or the kind of early warning signs with regard to whether or not someone needs help. And so over the past few years, both in the United States as well as outside of the United States, a number of digital therapeutics have been developed in the behavioral health space that are really having an impact on quality of life, on treatment, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think the evidence for the efficacy of these tools obviously still needs to be collected and addressed from a systematic perspective. But some of these things are really promising. And so, the warnings about privacy and security issues, I think, are important to consider because you certainly want to make people comfortable with this process and help them to understand that the data is going to be protected, that it won't be shared with third parties without their consent, that it's only used for certain purposes, et cetera, et cetera. And there's kind of an assumption that patients are okay with sharing data, and there is research that shows that patient-generated data is something that patients view very favorably. The issue is that the types of data collection that are being conducted are often done in a very, very intimate way that consumers don't really have much understanding of. And so the concern is that if there is a backlash or if there is more regulatory scrutiny of these particular applications in ways that are not helpful, that it could actually harm innovation as opposed to helping it. And so I think that's one of the major reasons that we should be thinking about this and talking about it and addressing it early on as opposed to later.
Right. I think to a great extent, this is sort of a major touchstone is the question of time, right? Of clinician time with patients. Clinicians never have enough time with patients, and this is the kind of thing that really requires a more extended conversation in order to get people comfortable with a certain approach to data sharing. And those conversations may not be happening. It also is not clear to me, and it varies from innovation to innovation, whether the information is being shared with the clinician or if it's simply being shared back with the pharma company, with the device manufacturer, with some other sort of care management third party, all of which sort of go to the question of how comfortable the patient will be with the sharing of this information.
Right. I mean, that kind of thing requires a lot of time and effort and work. And, the default right now in digital from a healthcare perspective is to simply collect and utilize the data, and the patients aren't really aware of what's really happening. And so, I think that there's an argument that's taking place in digital as well, digital from a healthcare perspective in other places, is how much do patients really care about data privacy and security? Um, there is, when people, in this way in the survey, when these issues are exposed, people express concern. Then later on, from an implementation perspective, people are less concerned. I think one of the things that's happening, one of the impacts of the Facebook issue is that people are starting to pay more attention to how much data and information is being collected. And there's certainly going to continue to be a cohort of people that don't really care about it that much. But I think increasingly what we're going to be seeing is wanting to have more privacy and wanting to have more control. And so I think that tension is not something that's going to be resolved in even a few years, but it's certainly going to continue to be there. And I think that it's something that people really need to be thinking about.
Absolutely. Well, Fard, I thank you for joining us on today's HIPAA chat, and I want to open up the conversation at this point to Carol and to our listeners to see if there are some questions for you or some broader questions about health data privacy and security in general. Carol?
All right. You can hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so for our attendees, you can use the question toolbox found on the dashboard to pose your question to David and also to Fard. So I'm going to just dive right in here and start addressing some of the questions from today's audience. First question, with the increase in medical tourism, can foreign participants waive their privacy, their HIPAA privacy?
So the right of privacy under HIPAA is always the patient's right, and the patient under HIPAA always has the right to waive a privacy right in order to get better information, meaning waive a privacy or a security protection in order to get better information delivered more easily in a more open way. So that's certainly the case within the US. I'm not certain if the listener is asking about services overseas. If the services are being provided overseas, that would be under a different sort of regulatory scheme in the host country.
Right. That makes sense. There are not enough doctors to handle the number of patients in the US today, and it will get much worse in the future. The connected healthcare direction is critical to the future of healthcare. What are your thoughts here?
About adding to the provider supply? Is
I
that the
think
question?
I could be wrong, and maybe he could chat back to me, but I think what they're saying is that there are concerns with connected healthcare, and subsequent question: how do HIPAA laws apply to the use of connected healthcare devices? So this issue of perhaps privacy and security, like it's their connected healthcare is going to increase over time, not decrease.
Right. I mean, there's certainly the kinds of tools that Fard has been describing to us today, along with other sorts of digital health tools, are only on the rise, and they are subject to different sorts of data privacy and security regulations. Now, interestingly, as longtime listeners will know, I've said this in the past, the same device, the same tool, the same program, depending on how it's used, can be subject to entirely different sorts of data privacy and security regulations. If it is provided to you by a healthcare provider or by your health plan, it may well come under HIPAA and be governed by health data privacy regulations. It may be the kind of device that you could buy yourself in a drugstore or online. And in that circumstance, that device or that tool or that app or whatever it is would not be subject to HIPAA because it's not being provided to you by a covered entity and you're not using it to deliver information to the covered entity. You're just using it to help yourself manage your health, right? But if you maintain any sorts of records in the software piece of whatever this is, and it could be as simple as an activity tracker, and you're tracking certain activity metrics. Once you share those metrics with your healthcare provider and they're incorporated into your health record, that becomes subject to HIPAA. It's in the healthcare provider's health record or in your health plan's records about you. They're a covered entity, it's going to be subject to HIPAA. But to the extent that the activity tracker or the app or the other device or tool is maintaining data and is not sharing it with what we consider the healthcare system, it's going to be subject to a different set of health data privacy and security rules, which may vary on a broader basis from state to state than would be the case under HIPAA. There would also be overarching Federal Trade Commission privacy regulations. So there, data is protected one way or another. And I think the other takeaway here is that, as Fard said, there's certainly a drive to use tools in order to increase the cost effectiveness of care delivery, both from a cost perspective and from an effectiveness perspective. Some of these tools are really good at what they do, and some of them do things that we were never able to do before. So all that is a good thing. In the broad scheme of things, we need to make sure that these quality improvements come at a globally reasonable price.
Right. Will the use of digital therapeutics require an opt-in in the form of an informed consent?
So again, it depends on how we are using them, but assuming that we are using them in a clearly healthcare context from a HIPAA perspective, to the extent that you are receiving care from a clinician, you have opted in when you have acknowledged receipt of the notice of privacy practices. Now, perhaps a clinical practice that is using something like this, a digital therapeutic, may need to think about going back and looking at their notice of privacy practices and seeing whether that needs to be adjusted given the passage of time and the change of the toolkit, the tool set that they're using. That's something that I often do with people. We tend to think that we can set up policies and procedures and put them on the proverbial shelf, but they do need to be revisited on a regular basis, particularly when operations change. So that's one sort of practice pointer. The other general proposition is that to the extent that it's used as part of the provision of care, the information gathered is going to be subject to the same general treatment as other information that is shared with your clinician. The parallel question, though, is what happens, how do we deal with the data that's being provided to third parties?
Right.
Are they all business associates of the healthcare provider, or are they something else? One example is the example of from a previous generation of devices, current generation of devices, is the implantable cardiac defibrillator. Okay, there's a lot of data that is collected by that implantable cardiac defibrillator that is, in the first instance, shared not with the clinician, not with the patient, but with the device manufacturer. And the device manufacturer will interpret that data and share a report with the clinician. When that report becomes part of the clinician's records, it then becomes available to the patient because the patient has the right to see his or her health records. Now, obviously, there's a great debate, as you can imagine, among health care providers, among device manufacturers, among patients and patient advocates about who has the right to that data and when, as in the thing is in my chest, I want that data right away. Why does it have to go halfway around the country and back before I get to see it? Right? So there's some progress being made on those fronts. And I'd invite Fard to comment on whether you see changes in the way this is dealt with in the age of the digital therapeutic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the major concerns that provider organizations have in the U.S. is how these particular solutions can be integrated into the clinician workflow in a way that makes sense. And so there's a lot of time being spent right now on the ways to reduce the burden that digital presents to to clinicians. And so where things used to be is that people would kind of pilot and test and bring these solutions into the clinical landscape, and clinicians were just simply expected to manage it. What's happening now is that provider organizations understand that clinician burnout, the limited time that they have to spend with patients, the burden that they have in terms of spending time with patients is significant. And it's also being made worse, by things such as electronic medical records and EHRs. And so I think with connected health solutions and a whole bunch of other things that are being done in healthcare right now, the focus is on really trying to integrate this into the clinician work in a way that makes sense. So one of the things that makes a digital therapeutic in the behavioral health space powerful is the fact that it provides essential information to the care team about how a patient, say with severe depression or bipolar or schizophrenia, is doing on a regular basis, and it provides them with the ability to proactively manage that patient. And so, I think that's why some of the more successful implementations of digital therapeutics are in the behavioral health space, because there's a focus and a need to actively track and intensively monitor the patient. From the perspective of other conditions, in utilizing digital therapeutics in, say, cardiovascular disease, there's a big interest in how can these tools actually make the job of making sure that clinicians can meet the goals that are being set very aggressively from an outcomes perspective, especially in this day and age of outcomes-based care. So I think that's something that's still being worked on, and it's something that's kind of being resolved on a case-by-case basis, on an innovation-by-innovation basis, on an implementation-by-implementation basis.
All right. You talked about cardiology. Somebody chatted in, is a patient's glucometer subject to HIPAA?
Again, I think that sort of ties into the same kind of analysis. Okay. Is this a device that is provided by the healthcare provider, by the clinician, or is information being shared back to the clinician? Is there information that's in the patient's health record, or is this something that's bought, whether by prescription or over the counter, is something that's used by the patient? Information stays with the patient unless the patient affirmatively shares it with the clinician, then it is outside of HIPAA.
So if somebody's sort of following that train of thought, what would you recommend a doctor have in their policies to cover themselves with a patient wanting to get them information from a home device, like you just mentioned? Do they need to have some sort of form for the patient to sign off on?
Well, it raises a whole host of issues. Number one is the potential for data overload, right? Imagine the hypochondriac patient who wants to send the doctor every last bit of data about his day, whether it's number of steps, whether it's glucometer readings, whether it's a million other things. how can a physician be expected, how can any clinician be expected to actually review all of that data from all of their patients? Um, so there needs to be a conversation about what kind of information should be shared, under what circumstances, and there are tools that can be used to configure alerts for a clinician to see that information from a patient only when it's out of bounds, right? If it's in a danger zone, if it's in a red zone, or if it's in the yellow zone, you don't need to see every bit of data all the time because otherwise you'd be overwhelmed. In that context, you need to establish what kind of information you're getting from what kind of devices into what kind of system, and that will sort of drive the policy and procedure development that you'll need to do.
You guys were talking about Facebook. One of the attendees want to know what HIPAA issues are involved if patients post comments about receiving good medical care on a medical group's Facebook page. It's a medical group's Facebook page, and the Facebook user is making a comment, good or bad. Are there HIPAA issues?
Well, if a patient is posting about his or her own condition or experience, again, HIPAA protects the patient. If a patient chooses to
Right.
share something publicly, then that's up to the patient, and it's not a black mark against the practice, so to speak. The danger is in the natural human tendency for someone who's responsible for maintaining that page at the practice to respond conversationally to the patient on the post. And the danger there is that the staff member reveals something more than what the patient revealed. And that could be done innocently but unconsciously and to the detriment of the patient. So my advice there is to have a very simple response. Thank you, great, whatever. Here's a link to our page on X that's relevant, if it's clearly relevant based on what the patient posted. But something more than that potentially gets you into trouble.
Right, right. And you could see how that could happen in, in the age of, where, companies are taught to, if somebody makes a comment on one of your social media platforms, you want to engage and respond. That's right. So you could see,
Yeah, and you certainly want to do that in healthcare. There's an extra layer of care that has to be imposed there. That's something that I talk to people about a lot because it's something that is easily overlooked because of our general socialization to respond as you described.
yeah. Are we seeing an increase in the privacy laws' private right of action?
That's a very interesting area because there is explicitly no private right of action under HIPAA. And to be clear, if someone's not clear on what that means if there is a HIPAA violation that affects my records, that doesn't mean that I can go sue the healthcare provider or the health plan under HIPAA. The availability of remedies in that situation under HIPAA itself is limited to U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The Office for Civil Rights, which enforces HIPAA, can levy fines, and state attorneys general can enforce HIPAA. So if HHS doesn't feel like dealing with a particular case, a state attorney general can bring a case and can fine a covered entity or business associate if that's what's necessary. What has happened over the past number of years is that the fact of a finding of a HIPAA violation can be used as evidence in a state court common law or state statutory law privacy action, right? So if in your state there's law that says that if you violate my privacy that I can sue you and collect damages, that's fine. That's under state law. What's changed in about a dozen or so states is that evidence of a HIPAA violation is good evidence of a violation of that duty to an individual to maintain the privacy of their information. So that helps you if there's been a finding at the federal agency level or at the state attorney general level.
Okay. I think we'll take one last question before we wrap. In the research that Fard is doing for his company on digital therapeutics, did they find that this is somewhat of a generational issue, meaning older patients are more concerned with their data privacy than younger patients?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Honestly, I have to look at the cut of the data from an age perspective. I can say that generally that from a data utilization and data privacy perspective, that sometimes people within younger cohorts are more comfortable using these tools and are less concerned in some respects with regard to some of the privacy implications. But for this particular set of research, I have to look back at the data to see how it cut by age and whether or not we were seeing more concerns among the older population.
Yeah. All right. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Fard, for joining as our guest today. We've got 30 seconds left. I want to let people know that a copy of the recording of this event will be sent out to you within 24 hours. And we're back again this summer with a HIPAA chat. I don't quite have the date locked in, but look for the notices on our websites and in your inbox. David, as always, a great conversation. We appreciate your time. And Fard, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a very topical and interesting conversation.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. All right. Till next time, I hope you all have a great Memorial Day weekend.